Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar on the U.S. Space Force. I also want to take a moment to thank Lockheed Martin for being our presenting sponsor. Support like this helps us deliver space news to the widest possible audience. We also want to extend a special welcome to the CubeSat building middle school students down in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, who are watching this live stream in Mr. Simmons Aerospace class. Go Wolverines. And now it's time for me to hand over today's webinar to my Space News colleague, Sandra Irwin. Sandra, do you want to take it?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you all for joining us for this very timely discussion on the Space Force. And we're going to start out with a conversation with Lieutenant General David Thompson, the Vice Commander of the Space Force, who is joining us from the Pentagon. So welcome, General Thompson. And after our conversation with the General, we will have a panel discussion with our panelists. So it's going to be really exciting. So I'd like to first welcome the General. How are you? Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Sandra. It's exciting to be with you today. The opportunity to continue our discussion about the U.S. Space Force. I hope you and everyone out there are safe and healthy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So let's just dive into some of the conversation topics. Of course, people saw this, people see what's happening in DoD with the COVID emergency and the challenges, and we just saw an extraordinary event with the commissioning of the 86 officers at the Air Force Academy. Also, we see that you're planning for the transfer of people into the Space Force starting May 1. Also, you have to continue your day-to-day mission of operating satellites, launching satellites, of developing new technology. So you have to balance all this right now. So I was wondering maybe if you could walk us through what are the next few months going to look like for the Space Force? What are we going to see in terms of personnel growth, transfers, and how do you see the Space Force evolving as an independent service going forward?
Sure, that would be great. And let me start where we always have to start, and that's with the mission. You mentioned the mission. And especially the mission in the face of the COVID pandemic that we're facing right now. Just, this week, obviously, we saw the launch of an Iranian satellite, the first military satellite from the Iranians. Last week, the Russians had launched, conducted an anti-satellite weapons test. So the missions and roles of military space continue through all of this, whether it's stand up the U.S. Space Force, the nation and the world dealing with the coronavirus. Those missions continue. And what I'll tell you is, first and foremost, we have taken the steps necessary that we need to ensure that we can execute those missions every single day. Missile warning, as we discussed with the Iranian launch, operating GPS for the nation, space domain awareness associated with the Iranian satellite and other things, those missions must continue. So one of the things that we did early in this campaign was go thoroughly through all of the things we needed to do to ensure our ops crews and our ops centers and all of the infrastructure and systems that are required to operate our military missions are able to continue. And so that's the first thing that we've done. But you're right. In the meantime, we are also continuing to build the U.S. Space Force, just approaching about 130 days since it was established at the end of December. And we are beginning what I'll call the next phase of activities to really build out the Space Force. On December 20th, when the Space Force was established, Secretary Barrett, Secretary of the Air Force, assigned 16,000 members to the Space Force, although they remained members of the United States Air Force. We are now in the process of doing two things over the next 60 to 90 days to continue to build the Space Force. The first is, earlier in this month of March, Secretary Barrett signed a memo that identified the additional units outside in the Air Force, not in the Space Force, whose functions and resources and missions will be transferred into the Space Force over the next 180 days. She did that. It's going to be about 1,800 people, 23 different organizations, but she's given us 180 days to do that so that we continue to build out the Space Force. She also made it very clear when she signed the memo that while the memo gave us 180 days, she expected more of these transfers to occur closer to 60 days than she did to 180 days. So we're going to build that out over the next several months. And as you noted, and has been reported by you and others here in the last day or two, we're now opening the window for members of the Air Force to volunteer to become members of the Space Force. Although individuals were assigned in December of last year, this includes the physical act of, in my case, for example, I would no longer be a member of the United States Air Force assigned to the Space Force. I would be a commissioned officer in the U.S. Space Force. The same with our enlisted members. They would no longer be enlisted members of the United States Air Force assigned to the Space Force. They will be enlisted members in the U.S. Air Force. I'm sorry, in the U.S. Space Force. That window opens on May 1st, and there's a couple of different categories. The first is members of the U.S. Air Force who are space operators today. We have officers and enlisted members who operate our satellites, our space systems every single day. All of those members, assuming they volunteer for transfer, will be accepted into the U.S. Space Force. We also have a need for a certain number of other specialties: intelligence officers and intelligence professionals, cyber operators, acquisition officers, engineers. We have a requirement for a set number of those, and so across the Air Force, there will be an opportunity for those specialties in the Air Force to volunteer as well. And so that volunteer window will be open for the month of May, and then we will go through the process of executing the processes and procedures that actually transfer them and make them members of the U.S. Space Force.
Thank you, General. Do you have an estimate of how many people will be asked, or how many people are eligible to transfer and will be asked to transfer in broad numbers? And how many of those do you expect will actually make the jump?
Yeah, so I do have the numbers on the space operators, right? That's on the order of about 6,000 to 7,000 people who do that today. They will all be offered the opportunity to transfer. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact numbers. For example, I don't have the exact number of intelligence officers in the United States Air Force, the exact number of engineers and others. But we anticipate, so the need for those is only going to be on the order of a few thousand. And so what we anticipate is we may very well get more volunteers for those positions than we have the ability to accept into the U.S. Space Force. So what we're going to do is we're creating a board process by which members of the Space Force and members of the Air Force, the senior leaders, review those applications, review those requests, and make a decision on who to accept and who not to accept, because our anticipation is we're likely to get more volunteers for several of those opportunities than we'll have the ability to accept into the Space Force.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But by the time we're done with that, in terms of military members, we'll have more than likely 6,000 to 7,000 additional members of the Space Force in uniform, in addition to civilian members we already have today.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that was submitted from the audience before the webinar, people want to know, what about the Army? The Army has a lot of space operators, and some of them actually have reached out to me and others and want to know, how do I join the Space Force? And so is there a way for them to volunteer as well?
So this specific initiative in May is targeted specifically at the Air Force. That's our authority today. There is a general authority for members of other services to always ask to cross commission. That's an authority that exists day to day for anybody. And there's certainly nothing that would prevent folks from using that today. But before we, as the Space Force, actively engage with the Army and the Navy, we need to make sure through the Secretary of Defense, through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and through the leadership of those services, we've decided what that should look like, how we're going to take that approach, who should be eligible to be directly asked or not. And so there's a lot of that work, a lot of those decisions that have not been made yet. That's work to be done with the Air Force, with the Space Force, with the Army, with the Navy, and with the Office of the Secretary of Defense before we go out specifically and ask for those sorts of volunteers. But you can anticipate that's likely to come in the months and probably as soon as next year.
Mm-hmm. And as far as these new graduates that are joining the Space Force, Are they all space operators?
No, actually they're not. They are a spread of specialties, just like we discussed earlier. The number entering, or the number that were commissioned, was 86. I think you report on that number. I think if I've got my numbers right, 57 of them will be space operators. I think, actually, let me just get my list out here so I'm sure. 57 will be space operators, 3 will be intelligence officers, 4 will be cyber officers. One of the important things we need in this new service is cyberspace operations to operate, protect, and defend our cyberspace infrastructure for space systems. And then 10 engineers and 12 acquisition officers. And in fact, they end up being the next 86. General Raymond, for a while, was the only member commissioned, right, in the Space Force. Chief Master Sergeant Roger Toberman joined him just a couple of weeks ago. And now these are numbers 3 through 88 in terms of the official member. But we've got a whole bunch of the rest of us in the Air Force who are lining up to join as quickly as we can.
So you have a plan for personnel to bring people in. Of course, one of your other priorities is capabilities, develop new capabilities, more advanced systems to deal with the threat environment and to advance technologically speaking. So I was wondering, how do you feel about the resources that are going to be made available to the Space Force? If you think about this recent budget that we saw, it was a transfer of the Air Force space accounts to the Space Force. We've been told that this new budget for FY22 is going to be more of a developed organically by the Space Force. So what can you tell us about your expectations as far as having your own budget, independent resources, independently from the Air Force budget? And do you feel confident that you will get what you need?
Yeah, so thanks. You're exactly right. The budget that we submitted for fiscal year 2021 that's now in Congress for consideration, it was officially the first budget submitted by the Space Force. But as you said, because the Space Force was created late in that cycle, most of the work had been done internal to the Air Force, and it was converted to a Space Force budget late. I will say, however, it was the most recent in a 4-year series of budgets that saw double-digit increases percentage-wise in the size of the budget, and a shift in focus. Not only did we need to continue to provide the services and the capabilities we have for years, positioning, navigation, timing, missile warning, satellite communications, and other things, but it was the latest in a shift in our focus to create resilient systems, defensible systems, and systems that would provide command and control and help us protect and defend those as well. So we've made a significant shift while we were still part of the Air Force in that regard. We've seen double-digit increases as well. Going into 22, we are actually in the middle of creating the fiscal year 2022 budget now. As you might imagine, it's an interesting exercise as we do it in a COVID environment. But I will say the emphasis of space inside of the Department of Defense will continue. That guidance is already clear. It is going to be the first completely developed standalone budget for the Space Force, and it is going to continue the focus on the shift that we've made over the last several years, building resilient systems, building systems that can be defended and protected and operate through any potential threats and conflicts posed by an adversary. The other thing I'll say in that regard, if I can, is we've also recently completed a report that's being reviewed by senior members of the Department of Defense to propose a new, more agile, more responsive acquisition system. That's a report that was required by Congress last year to help us increase the speed and the agility and our ability to field these capabilities that help us to operate in a warfighting environment.
So to your point about developing capabilities and having a more agile acquisition system, this was another question that a lot of people submitted in different forms, but pretty much saying the same thing. What they see right now is overlapping authorities with different organizations. They see, the NRO, the SMC, the Space Development Agency, Space Rapid Capabilities Office, and each agency operates differently. Each agency has different authorities. So people in the industry want to know, how can we better support the Space Force? And is there a way to maybe have a more synchronized acquisition organization as opposed to multiple organizations? So have you looked at that, and what can we expect to see in the future?
Yeah, so yes, clearly we recognize inside the department the same concerns and challenges that have been recorded there by the members of industry. This isn't just a matter of acquisition process, and I talked a little bit about some of the recommendations in our report to Congress that will help to streamline that, make the lines of authority clear, and make sure we can be more effective across all of those organizations. But there's also another element, a line of activity as we stand up the Space Force that is organizational. And as part of that organizational line of effort, it is our responsibility through Secretary Barrett and through General Raymond, the Chief of Space Operations, to bring forward to the Secretary of Defense and others our proposal for how the acquisition functions and organizations that perform space-related acquisition in the Department of Defense should be aligned and organized, and under what authorities and how they should operate. And so what I can say here is we are definitely engaged in the process of developing that structure, that proposal, what the organization should look like, how it should work together, where the organizations need to be integrated, where they need to work independently, and I'll call it the lanes in the road among all of them as part of the design work we're doing for the next phase of implementation with the U.S. Space Force.
Mm-hmm. And the next phase is when is that starting?
So what I would say is the next phase is we're preparing most of it. Some of it is internal realignment, right? Some of it is the internal realignment we're doing right now. Space RCO, Space and Missile System Center, those are organizations that are part of the U.S. Space Force today. But with respect to Space Development Agency, Missile Defense Agency, and some of those others, you might anticipate things happening as soon as next year in that regard. That requires a little more time, effort, more coordination, and approval through, in some cases, the Department of Defense, and others, some may require congressional support.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, I have to ask you about some of the culture aspects of the Space Force that I know you have discussed before about. When are we going to see the new logo? When are we going to see the name? When are we going to know what the Space Force members will be called? And I know General Raymond said there was a crowdsourcing effort. So I know that I'm sure it's not the number one priority right now, but what can you tell us? I mean, people that are now ready to sign up to join, I'm sure they want to know.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things in that regard. You're right. We've been working those. We continue to work those. You talked about the crowdsourcing activities. All of those have occurred. In some ways, for some things, we'll keep doing those. Right now, there's a series of recommendations we're preparing for a senior leader decision. And I'll say that's probably one of the few areas that has slowed down a little bit, mostly because the focus naturally of our senior leaders on COVID, the response and the activities there. But it's still moving forward. We still anticipate that near term. But I really do like, there was a statement by one of the newly commissioned officers at the United States Air Force Academy, before, I think it was made about a couple of days before he was actually commissioned, who said, I care less about what I'm going to be called and more about the systems I'm going to operate in and how I'm going to execute missions in space. And I love that attitude. We need to have those other things, those culture related things, but give me 86 people like that, and they'll build the culture that we want and need in the Space Force, whatever the logo is and whatever uniform.
And the Air Force bases that are going to be renamed Space Force bases, is that also coming up in the near future?
Again, the focus of the nation has moved elsewhere for now. It's certainly not off the plate, but we're going to make sure, part of what we wanted to do is make sure it was an appropriate recognition with the local communities. And obviously, when you look at the sensible restrictions and the way we want to do it right, and we want to celebrate, especially with those local communities. So now is not quite the right time to do it, but it is still upcoming.
Yeah. So I know you don't have a lot of time, so I wanted to leave a few minutes. I know Brian has been getting some audience questions live, so I was wondering, maybe Brian, if you could maybe ask some of these audience questions.
Yeah, definitely, Sandra. General, thanks very much. A lot of folks, there's a lot of questions today about people who are very eager to be part of Space Force. They want to join Space Force. You're going to have to handle that at some point through a separate recruiting effort, and I imagine you'll get a lot more applications once Netflix's Space Force show comes out. Maybe not the right kind of applicants, but you'll get some. But rather than delve into that, there were a lot of questions about the acquisition reform that you folks are developing. One of the questions was, the Space Force has a finite window to make significant cultural and procedural changes, including with space acquisition. What fundamental changes will the Space Force make in acquisition, and will the Space Force have its own acquisition authorities?
Yeah, so two things in that regard. First of all, I would love to be able to share a few more of those details right now related to acquisition. I can't yet because we haven't completed the final review and approval before we submit it to Congress. But what I will say in that regard is we actually developed this report. We brought in experts from the NRO. We brought in experts from Space Development Agency, from the Missile Defense Agency, from many other acquisition arms across the DoD, not just focused on space acquisition. And we asked them and worked with them on the elements of their acquisition processes that they felt made them effective, made them agile, made them responsive. And what we've created as a result in the report is a series of recommendations that make the most sense for the Space Force. And what I'll say is, in doing that approach, it helped us in two ways. The first is, since in most cases these are sensible steps that are used by others, it's not entirely unexpected or unreasonable to say, if others are using these sorts of processes, why can't we? And while taken individually, they are relatively simple steps. When you put them all together in the number of steps in the manner we have, we absolutely think it's going to be a bold and groundbreaking approach to acquisition. So that's the first thing I'd say. And I'm sorry, give me the second part of the question again. I didn't write it down.
Well, it was whether the Space Force will have its own acquisition authorities.
Yeah. Well, and I think you've seen what the NDAA calls out in that regard with respect to what the space acquisition executive. We're not really addressing anything that isn't already out there in law as part of this report.
And what's the latest timeline for when those of us outside of the Space Force in the public might see what your acquisition reform report suggests?
So I'd say, like I said, it's in the final stages of review with the department. The department will in the very near term submit it to Congress, and my presumption is that time it'll be available to the public as well.
All right. And I got one other one for you. There's multiple requests here for you to speak a little bit about efforts underway to reduce classification related to national security satellites.
Yeah, and that's one of the efforts that's been going on for a while. The current Vice Chairman, General John Hyten, actually began pushing on that hard when he was commander of Strategic Command, and has recently helped us re-energize that process. What we really need is what I'll call a normalized approach to classification, as you see in other domains. It's just part of the culture that we grew up with that we need to change, was that desire to deeply hold and deeply protect secrets related to space. Because we're in a new, much more transparent era in terms of what people can see, because we need to move out into a coalition environment and have the ability to share so we can operate effectively, what you will see is us push aggressively to have a classification regime that makes sense when you look at it in the light of the classification regime you might see with air systems or maritime systems or anything else like that. So hopefully that's another thing we'll be re-energizing here shortly as we come out, as we adapt to what the new normal in this environment is going to be. And I think I've got time, and I'm going to apologize. I think I have time for one last question.
Well, if you didn't, I know you outlined kind of the timelines for folks who are already in the service transferring over to Space Force. Did you address when people who aren't in the service at all, when conceivably they might be able to sign up to join the Space Force?
No, I have not, and that's a great question. Another of the reports required by Congress due in June is what is called a human capital management report. And we absolutely recognize, and you made a little bit of reference to it earlier, we absolutely want in addition to those sorts of folks we have today, we want to open up the aperture in terms of different minds, different ideas, different specialties to help us think new and differently about space. And so as part of that, we're developing ideas and concepts and processes for perhaps the ability to accept and hire people directly off the street, to allow them to flow more freely between service inside the Space Force and in industry and other things, and also a new and different thought process in terms of who we want, why we want them, and what we expect them to bring. In fact, there's a lot of discussion of, because the numbers in year over year are going to be relatively small, we may in fact talk about instituting a model like the submarine fleet has used for years and others, where on a case-by-case basis, individuals may be required, in addition to other things, to accomplish an interview process before we decide to accept them.
All right. Well, thank you very much, General Thompson. We really appreciate you joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
All right, Brian. Thanks very much. Like I said, I wish I could stay a little longer, but I appreciate you all hosting this and helping us to continue the dialogue.
You're always welcome back. Thanks very much.
Stay safe.
Thank you, General.
So now it's time for us to transition to a little discussion of what we heard and some other issues that are facing the Space Force. And for that, Sandra will introduce our panel of experts.
Thank you very much, Brian. Yes, we have an excellent panel that's going to get into all these different topics that General Thompson has teed up. We have Todd Harrison, Senior Fellow of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We also have Caitlin Johnson, Associate Director of the CSIS Aerospace Security Project. Also Brian Weaving, Director of Program Planning at the Secure World Foundation. We have Bill Wolf, President of the U.S. Space Force Association, and J.V. Venable, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So thank you very much to all the panelists for joining us. I maybe wanted to start out with maybe a question for Todd as far as, you know, what you heard from General Thompson. Can you give us your take? I mean, these are very ambitious plans to bring in 6,000 to 7,000 space operators. What are some of the challenges that you see going forward in terms of the administrative challenges and also resource challenges, and just creating an environment for these space operators that is not going to be too disruptive? What are some of your thoughts, Todd?
Yeah, I mean, just to, you know, focus a bit on what he said, that, you know, people who are doing the work for the Space Force today are the same people who are doing the space-related work in the Air Force before the Space Force was created. And so, you know, that work has continued without change. There's virtually no disruption there at all. The key distinction, though, is people switching their commission over from the Air Force to the Space Force, which requires a little bit of paperwork and taking a new oath of office. And so I think that, you know, there likely be very minimal disruptions when it comes to that. And, you know, like he said, I think that they're likely to find that there are a lot of people who want to transition over and change their commission to the Space Force because they see a lot of opportunities that this new, innovative, small service will provide for their career. So the biggest disruptive problem he may have is how to sort through all of these people and make sure they are only getting the cream of the crop transitioning over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And I wanted to maybe go to Caitlin for a question on the challenges, the threat challenges that General Thompson mentioned. He brought up the ASAT, anti-satellite test that the Russians did just recently. And I know you've been studying and researching whether do we have the capabilities in the U.S. to address these, to make space more defendable and more resilient. And what do you see for the Space Force? What do you see as some of the issues they have to address in the near term as they figure out how to deal with these threat environments?
Right, thanks, Sandra. So I think one of the largest challenges is, of course, these threats are still going to continue happening while the Space Force has to take on a new acquisition or a structure, hiring all of these people. As someone who hires myself, I don't envy the hiring people of the Space Force, because they are going to get way more applications than they actually have jobs available. I know in the initial run, there's like 1,800 billets, and I'm sure they're going to get thousands of applicants. And while they're sorting through all this, they also have to continue to maintain the high standards that we have for protecting our national security space assets. The Russian ASAT test last week was, non-destructive. It didn't actually intercept anything on orbit, and it wasn't very much a surprise. They've been testing this system or similar systems for years now, but so has China and now India. What we're really seeing proliferating, and what the Aerospace Security Project wrote in our Space Threat Assessment 2020, and what our colleagues at the Secure World Foundation wrote in their Global Counterspace Report, is that other types of counterspace weapons are proliferating faster and being used in a more widely and varied environment, which includes conflict zones, but also non-conflicts, and places where there's actually, nothing going on. And these kind of counterspace weapons are becoming normalized in everyday use. And that's what is also concerning, is how is the Space Force going to address that as well, not just worrying about what happens if there's conflict in space, or if our space assets are actually, physically attacked, but what happens if there's any sort of reversible, denial environment where our GPS system is being cut off for commercial shipping activity off the sea of China or something like that. And so all of these different issues that they're having to sort through organizationally and acquisition structure and hiring are going to be challenging when, the world is going to move on and the threat environment is going to continue.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for that insight, Caitlin. Since we're talking about threats, I wanted to go to Brian Whedon and mention the Iranian satellite launch that General Thompson brought up. And yesterday, the Pentagon, they were not ready to confirm. I think today they confirmed it, that this was a military satellite. Brian, what do you think what does this really mean? Is this actually a threat, or is this, is this a legitimate space program, or is this a ballistic missile program, which is what some people in the Pentagon say, that's what their concern is right now? What can you tell us about what you've heard since yesterday?
Sure. So what we know is that Iran has attempted to launch satellites several times in the past. Their first one was successful back around 2009, but since then they've had several failed attempts to put a satellite up. This was a successful launch, and it appears to have been very different from the previous ones. The previous ones were all conducted by the Iranian Space Agency, which is what they say is their civil space program. This one was launched by essentially the Iranian military, and they have claimed it as a purely military satellite, and they've talked about it providing some sort of military function, although we don't yet know what that function is. By all accounts, it's a relatively small satellite because the rocket they use does not really have much throw weight. It's in a pretty low orbit, 450 kilometers, sorry, less than 400 kilometers. So, maybe some sort of a military communications satellite, maybe a small imagery satellite. We're not really sure yet. At this point, it doesn't look like it poses any sort of counterspace threat to other systems. It seems to be more of probably a demo or a test of a future military capability. In general, Iran has a fairly robust ballistic missile program, and it seems like they've basically did a hybrid of one of their missiles and a space launch vehicle for this. So, it was not really a huge surprise in that we've known they've had this sort of missile technology. As far as whether this is, just another missile test, I don't really think so, because they've clearly done some steps to make it a part of their space program. There's indications that maybe it was a liquid stage, which is not really what you want for sort of an operationally effective ICBM. So to me, this looks more like a military space, the beginnings of a military space program than anything else. And there's no indications at this point in time that what they put up presents a threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to follow up also with you, Brian, on the Russian anti-satellite test that the Caitlin also talked about, because it seems like, people like you said, we knew this was coming. This was a routine test. However, it was brought up by DoD as a threat activity, as a threatening activity. So what is the disconnect between what's happening in the space world internationally, and then some of the reaction that we hear from DoD?
Sure. Yeah, so we have been tracking this particular Russian system in our report, and so have Caitlin and Todd in the CSIS report. It appears to be a system called Noodle. This is a mobile ground launch direct destination ASAT system. It's been in development since roughly 2014 or so. It's a little bit hard to judge, but this seems to have been the 9th or 10th time it has been tested. And all these tests are essentially flight tests of the missile part of the system. So for almost all the tests, Russia has put out the traditional notice to airmen and mariners that almost all countries do for rocket tests, essentially a safety warning. And so we've been able to follow those and sort of note the flight path. And as Caitlin pointed out, this particular test did not hit anything in space. And as far as we can tell, it wasn't trying to hit anything in space. It was a test of the rocket. And that's typically what you see when there is a military program to develop a capability, is it lasts several years, there's multiple tests, and the tests sort of build on each other to eventually do more and more sophisticated testing. Now, at some point, they might try and intercept a space object or a satellite, like we've seen in the last decade from China, from the US, from India. I certainly hope they don't, because that would create a bunch of space debris, which we don't really need more of. But in general, this is part of the proliferation of counter-space capabilities globally that Caitlin referred to. And it's something that's been going on since at least the early 2000s.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you so much, Brian, for that insight. So I wanted to maybe go to Bill Wolf for a minute to talk about some of the points that General Thompson made. Bill, you have a tight connection to the operator community in Colorado. You're based in Colorado. What are people telling you about the possibility of joining the Space Force, the opportunities in the Space Force, and what concerns do you hear from people? Can you talk a little bit about that? Thanks.
You bet, Sandra. Thanks so much to you and Brian for putting this on, and to the other panelists for being online today to get the word out, because that's really ultimately what we're trying to do, is get the word out to the American people that this is a new venture that we're on, discussing space as a warfighting domain. And General Thompson mentioned that there was a cadet that he heard about that said they're more concerned about the mission and not so concerned about the logo and the uniform. That was actually Cadet Cohen Williams. Had a great opportunity to sit down with him at the Air Force Academy before he graduated, and interviewed him on what his expectations were as he went into the Space Force. And he is really excited. I sat down with all the cadets, actually had an opportunity to sit down with all of them and get their perspective and what their concerns were moving into the Space Force and going into that new service. Extremely excited. They are looking forward to what lies ahead. They are really looking forward to how they can shape and inform this new warfighting domain. And they're looking forward to innovating inside the domain. What type of visual capabilities, and we're just talking about it now in terms of threats to space systems. Space domain awareness is a huge mission set. And they're concerned about how do we visualize that to show the impact to operations when critical capabilities are put at risk. And so those are questions that they're already stepping up. In that podcast, we talked a little bit about the Institute for Applied Space Policy that has stood up there at the Air Force Academy. And this is where they're having those discussions in an academic setting. So ultimately, I think he's absolutely right. And I think you mentioned it already. There's going to be a lot of people applying for this new service, and they're going to have to ultimately turn folks away.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that, do you think that the Space Force needs to communicate what they do better? I mean, don't people still, even people in the Air Force Academy, still don't know what the Space Force is?
There's a lot of questions around the Space Force, and you can tell that because there is that new Netflix special coming out with Steve Carell called The Space Force. And I tell you, I was talking to a friend of mine Colonel Two Fish Fisher, he's the 50th Space Wing Vice Commander, astronaut, 186 days in orbit. He is super excited about it. And he talks about kind of embracing the stereotype. He said, you know what, people are going to make fun of the space professional, and that's expected. But we need to embrace that stereotype and then own it, and then develop that culture that we need to develop in support of the future Space Force. So that's all going to come out. Exactly all the mission sets, the space domain awareness, space electronic warfare, orbital warfare, all that doctrine is being written by the experts in the Space Force right now and the leadership team that they've got in place. And it's all going to come to fruition when it needs to. And it's just a lot of work. I mean, that is a really tough challenge to stand up a new service. Last time it's been done was, in 47. So there's a lot of work, and they had a year and a half to do it. So there's a lot of work involved in this, and I expect more information to come out definitely as it gets closer to full operational capability.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bill, for that perspective, and I also wanted to allow JV to comment on some of the points made by General Thompson about resources and budget. I know you follow budgets and you understand how the Pentagon works. Are they going to have the visibility? Are they going to be able to fight for resources in the Pentagon being that small? I mean, even if they get 6,000 people, it's still going to be a very small force. I know you have raised some concerns. What is your reaction to what the general said, and what potentially could be happening in terms of them being able to get the budget that they're looking for?
Sandra, great question. Thank you for having me, and thanks for hosting this, Brian, and Lockheed Martin, thanks for sponsoring it. Great questions across the board. This idea of having the right size budget for this organization, so far, it's kind of been under the covers. This last year, the budget that they requested was something over $70 million just for 2020. But much of that budget that they actually operated on, procured on, and then researched and developed and tested, all of that was underneath the Air Force. This year, they're going to get, if the president's budget is enacted, over $15.3 billion, but that still will not incorporate personnel. Personnel costs will still be under the Air Force. And so I see their budget being robust enough to do whatever they need to do. Inside the building, although they have a small footprint, I think their voice is going to be pretty large. And if they have any challenges with that, I know that the congressional support that they could call on would support them greatly. Biggest challenge in this is to continue to expand a couple of ideas. And one is, this is not just Air Force personnel we ought to be looking at. General talked about 16,000 people being administratively assigned, and then bringing on board 6,000 to 7,000 people this year and the next. The Air Force has got something on the order of 27,000 space professionals, people who work in and around that realm. And we really need to look at getting them all on board by the end of fiscal year 2022, the next fiscal year. But then this planning has got to continue to go and look at Army and Navy professionals, not just for volunteers, but bringing those capabilities that are down in Huntsville and several other locations, really critical to making this organization work right. That the challenge in all of this is assimilating and building the culture associated with this organization. You know, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you watched several airlines come together. People who do the same job don't necessarily get along well. And you watch that when TWA was brought into American Airlines. And so this stand-up, this idea of culture is really important as well. DHS in the early 2000s also stood up very quickly. And that organization's still not completely sound as far as functionality goes and culture goes. And so I think the leadership in this new Space Force has got several challenges. I think the least of those is their budget.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's good perspective. Thank you, JV. And Brian Berger, do you have some audience questions for the panel?
We have a lot of audience questions, so let's take a look at some of those. While I while I find some good ones to ask, we do have a poll on the Air Force Academy that maybe we can pull up here for the audience to answer, and I'll get you some audience questions. A lot of our questions were directed at the general. So here's a poll for you guys. Time for you to weigh in on the best choice of color for Space Force uniforms. So we'll leave that up there for a few minutes, let everybody answer. All right. So we have members of the audience who are interested in the panelists' thought on where Space Force headquarters might locate and a timeline for that decision and announcement. Sandra, perhaps you might even be the best one to answer that one.
Say again?
The location of Space Force headquarters, timeline for making that decision and making the announcement.
Well, I think you're getting confused with Space Command because Space Force headquarters is in the Pentagon. Space Command, US Space Command headquarters is now being discussed. It's temporarily at Peterson Air Force Base, but there are other locations being discussed. And I think they said it would be decided in late 2020. So I would be looking for a decision maybe after the presidential election because they don't want it to be too political. So I think those two are getting confused.
All right. Perhaps the panel can share some of their predictions about the Space Force provisions that'll be included in the 2021 NDAA and appropriations bills.
Maybe that's a Todd Harrison question.
Yeah, actually, if I could jump in on the last question there, I think it actually represents, a lot of the fundamental misunderstandings about the Space Force that are out there that need to be addressed. I think a lot of people are still getting confused between U.S. Space Command and the Space Force, and it is confusing because what was formerly Air Force Space Command is now, the Air Force's service component that has been elevated to be the Space Force. So Air Force Space Command became Space Force. And the space component of U.S. Strategic Command is what now became U.S. Space Command. And so that is the combatant command in charge of space. Space Force is the military service whose job is to organize, train, and equip. Of course, the combatant command's job is to conduct the real-world operations with the forces provided by the service. So I think there's still a lot of education that needs to be done there. And in many cases, I think people still need to be educated about what the Space Force will not do. I see in some of the audience questions that are popping up, people are asking about human spaceflight and NASA. And I think, every opportunity possible, senior space leaders need to reemphasize that the military doesn't do human spaceflight. It doesn't do science and exploration. That is entirely the job of NASA. The Space Force, if you're going to join the Space Force, you're not going to space. Your job will be to operate and acquire satellite systems from Earth. And so, there's still a lot of that, miscommunication that's out there. In terms of, what we're going to be looking for in Congress this year in the NDAA, as well as the appropriations bills, I would say that, big thing is there will probably be some legislative language making minor tweaks to the Space Force bill that passed last year to just clarify things of what Congress meant, to fix some things where there were oversights. I'm hopeful that one of the things they will fix, it relates directly to General Thompson's position. The vice chief of the Space Force right now is a 3-star position. The vice chiefs of all the other services are 4 stars. Now, this is relevant because when they meet together in things like the JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the Space Force needs to have someone of equal rank. Now, you don't need to create a new 4-star billet to elevate that position to a 4-star. You just need to transfer another 4-star billet into the Space Force. So hopefully that's something that either the service, the Air Force will correct itself, or Congress may need to step in and legislate that happen.
I'm sorry if I can jump in, Todd. Do you foresee that General Raymond will be dual-hatted as Chief of the Space Force and Chief of U.S. Space, Commander of U.S. Space Command for the foreseeable future? I know the NDAA said it would just be for 1 year, but is that likely to be extended?
No, I don't think it will. I think that was, very much a deliberate decision that they wanted to allow that temporarily. Now, keep in mind, General Raymond was already dual-hatted in both of those same jobs in previous organizational structure. He was the commander of Air Force Space Command, the service component, as well as the commander of the space component of U.S. Strategic Command. So both of his organizations and both of his jobs got elevated. And so that's why he's still in this dual-hatted role. But I think it very much is the intent of Congress, and I think it is a good idea to separate those roles going forward. I mean, can you think of any other example where a service chief and a combatant commander, those jobs have been held by the same person at the same time? I can't think of an example in modern military history since we've had the combatant command structure. And so, those are two really big jobs. And I think those will be separated after the 1 year period expires.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Brian, back to you. Any other audience questions?
Well, we have a ton of them. You all are welcome to kind of sift through them. A lot of these topics have kind of been addressed indirectly. A lot of people are kind of interested in finding out how they're going to be able to do business with the Space Force. We heard from General Thompson that they're still working on their acquisition reform report, but I think people want to know, do they have acquisition capability right now, or for the time being, if you have a space system to sell the U.S. military, are you still going through the Air Force for all intents and purposes? So kind of what's the current situation? What do people see coming down the road in the next 6 months, a year? And any predictions about whether Space Force will be easier for space industry to work with than Air Force Space? And Sandra, you can maybe parcel that one out to whoever you think is best to address some of these points.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe Caitlin, I know you've looked at the organizational side of the Space Force. I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this acquisition reorganization? I mean, right now it's pretty much transitioned from the Air Force, but according to what we heard, one of the proposals that they have is to give more authority to the Space Force. And I think General Thompson suggested that that's something that they want, but can they actually get more authority to be more independent in their acquisition as opposed to being just going everything through the Air Force? What are your thoughts? And maybe JV also, if you'd like to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I'll weigh on parts of it. I can't speak to all of it. I'm not sure if the Space Force will be easier or harder to work with than the Air Force. Mm-hmm. But I do know that acquisition is a top priority, as we heard from the general earlier, as a lot of these questions and our conversation has been going. I mean, this is on the forefront of everyone's mind, including Congress. So kind of tying it back into the last question, I do think acquisition as a priority will be something that Congress will be looking at with the next year's NDAA, like Todd said, to kind of tweak the language, really looking at this acquisition report that the Space Force will be submitting to Congress, if that suggests any sort of legislative changes or additional authorities given. I think we'll kind of see the rumblings of that with this year's NDAA. Right now, we have several different space acquisition agencies, including SMC, Space RCO, the Space Development Agency, acquisition authorities within the Air Force for space. I mean, it's kind of messy there, as well as the NRO doing intelligence acquisition in their own classified satellites. And so I think what they're trying to sort out is how to combine them all into a streamlined organization, either one organization or making sure there's not a lot of overlap. And hopefully the Space Force will be able to direct businesses to the right organizations to pitch the right proposals, so that you're not wasting everybody's, your own time, but by pitching it to maybe the wrong people. That's kind of what I envision. But as we heard, the acquisition report is still being finalized, and we don't know from the public side anything really about it other than what the general shared with us this morning and what we've heard in the past few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, JV, what do you think about their idea that in this acquisition report, they're going to ask to have, to consolidate programs into portfolios, so it's more flexible for them to move money around? I mean, that's usually those things don't go over well with Congress. What is your sense of how Congress will react to this idea that they need more flexibility with funding and that they want more authorities to do requirements outside of the Pentagon process?
I think they're going to run up against some hurdles with that, Sandra. The NRO has got a strong lobby in Congress, and the developing lobby for the Space Force is there. But this is something that I think even inside of Congress, when you look at the folks who sponsored this Space Force from its initiative on forward, even they are separating the two. And so they're going to dance around this for a while, I believe. But this transition, as hard as it is also magical, because this is kind of like one person riding two dolphins at SeaWorld. It's the same person you're going to be talking to tomorrow for the Space Force that you're talking to today for the Air Force acquisition process for space. And as they swap uniforms, they're going to be able to just basically answer the same mail. And as they shift from their current office structure or organizational structure into more of a space acquisition, quote unquote, billet, they'll change offices, but very likely those professionals will stay in that same realm. So I don't see a drastic and significant earth-shaking change taking place in the near term. I think that this is a chasm people can develop in their minds that doesn't actually exist right now. And the transition, if they do this right, is going to be relatively smooth and relatively seamless, going from Air Force into Space Force acquisition.
Mm-hmm. And of course, when you talk about acquisition, you have to talk about the Army, which is the military's biggest user of space. And I wanted to maybe go to Brian Wheaton, because I know you've had some thoughts on this. Can the Space Force be a true Space Force if they don't have the Army space operators, if it's just an Air Force organization? What do you think is going to be the implications of maybe not bringing in the Army and not bringing in all the resources that the Army has for space?
Well, that's a really big question, and it's something that the Space Force needs to deal with, but it's not unique. Let's look, for example, at the air world. We have the Air Force, which is the service dedicated to the air domain, but not everything that flies in the air the military does is in the Air Force. The Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps all have their own air and aviation units and forces and aircraft in some cases and people. And so it really kind of it can be very complicated to figure out what belongs in the Space Force and what the other services are going to do. And sometimes that breaks down along the lines of what is sort of part of the true space operations and what is more of the other services needs for supporting what they're going to do. And frankly, sometimes that comes down to organizational trust. It wouldn't be the first time that one service wasn't quite sure they could rely on another service, and so they did something themselves. In the case that we talk about the Army has a pretty large contingent of space experts, the FA-40s, who help the Army understand how to use space and how to integrate space capabilities, things like imagery, things like satellite communications and PNT into Army operations. That's a real question as to whether those should be Army people first and foremost that then maybe learn about space, or whether they become Space Force people that then learn about how the Army works. And there's pros and cons of how either of those works. I've seen it done both ways of the services. So I don't think there's in my mind, there's not a clear answer one or the other. There's pros and cons, and it's part of what's going to get sorted out here. One last point, I like to remind people to borrow a phrase, we are more at the beginning of this process than the end. As people have pointed out, there's a lot of work that needs to happen. And this is going to be a years-long effort to stand up the Space Force, to transfer in people, transfer in capabilities, to make make a shift towards what we're going to be in the future. This is not going to happen overnight. And so there needs to be a little bit of patience here in, there's quite a lot of things to be sorted out, and it's going to take time to sort it out.
Brian, this was going to be a huge undertaking even before COVID-19 became a global pandemic back in March. That can't make anything any simpler, from budget impacts looking ahead to the fall when the United States has to start thinking about how they're going to pay off the huge tab they're running up. Space Force is the new kid on the block, to just the practical aspects of trying to work policy through Congress, through the Pentagon. Maybe Brian, Todd, anybody else wants to address that as we near the end of this webinar, COVID-19 impacts.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think that there's a near-term and a long-term impact from the coronavirus and the economic turndown that we're in the middle of right now. The near-term impact is really going to be on the space industry. And so, full disclosure, I'm on the board of advisors of this outside group called the National Security Space Association, and the NSSA actually sent a letter to Undersecretary Lord and others, General Raymond and others, highlighting some of these issues. I think is really instructive. And in particular, some of the smaller space companies are really vulnerable right now, especially the space companies that the military may have been expecting to be there. A lot of the commercially oriented space companies. This economic downturn could not have hit at a worse time for many of them, right? When they had already, spent a lot of capital, but are in many cases in early stages of getting revenue or pre-revenue even. And so we don't, as a nation, if we want to be competitive, if we want to be innovative, we don't want to lose this vital part of our space industrial base. And so I think that's one of the near-term impacts to watch. And I would say that I think there's some good feedback from that letter already. You saw Undersecretary Lord come out last week, I believe, and talk about some of the impacts. And DoD has issued guidance on how it's going to use some of the special authorities like the Section 3610 authorities from the CARES Act to help industry where they're being directly affected by this. So that's, it's good news and it's progress in the right direction, but it's still a concern. The long-term impact I'm worried about is, you look out 2-3 years into the future, like you said, Brian, we are running, record high deficits now because of the stimulus measures and the reduction in revenues that we're expecting. We could see, the annual deficit top $3, maybe even $4 trillion this year and in FY21. When that has happened in the past, when we've seen deficits go up in the past, what we see, happening later is often that the fiscal hawks come out in Congress and they start driving a deficit-driven budget reductions for defense and non-defense programs. So we could see austerity coming in around FY22, 23, and if you see a downturn in the defense budget right now, that will inevitably affect all parts of defense, including space. And so, we've got to be thinking ahead now. And that's where I said this in an op-ed last week in Defense News, but that's where DoD and the Space Force included has got to do a really good job right now of articulating what are their crown jewels, what are their top acquisition priorities that they want to protect no matter what. And really focus on pushing those things forward, and then have a contingency plan. If the budget does come down, all right, if you're going to protect the top priorities, what are you willing to sacrifice?
Thanks, Todd. So I'm wondering if anybody else has any hopes, predictions, fears, concerns, worries about how COVID-19 might play into both getting Space Force stood up, and also I think there's a lot of emphasis on one of the hopes for Space Force is that it kind of bodes well, or could bode well, for getting the capabilities into the field that are needed in a contested space environment. Does that become more difficult now because the Space Force is the new kid on the block, and if we have an especially bare knuckles budget process ahead of us, um, are they better off on their own, or would they be better off if space acquisition was still within the larger Air Force? And let's hear somebody else chime in on that.
Brian, I think that the Space Force is going to ride this better than all of the other services. If there's someone who's going to take torpedoes amidship, I don't believe it's going to be the Space Force. Their bang for the buck is very, very high, and the cost that this new force, even if it goes 40 or 50,000 with the acquisition and the assimilation of the Army and the Navy, I think you're still going to see a budget total of about $500 million in excess of where we are right now to get an enormous capability for the United States. I think that the other services, as Todd mentioned, you go to 2022 and 2023, no matter how hard you fight, I think we're going to look at an austere period for the other services. Their big acquisition tickets have got to be protected.
Thanks, JV. Bill, what do you think? Is the Space Force adequately organized to fight the political fights that they face on the Hill this year?
Yeah, I tell you, it all goes back to the warfighter. You know, ultimately now we're creating this new warfighting culture, and JV spoke about it. JV, as well as I, was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, and we'd always look forward to the Combat Air Force's Weapons and Tactics Conference. It was a great time to get together and get the tacticians and warfighters together to talk about the capability gaps, both from a material and non-material point of view, and stand in front of leadership and talk about the minimum force requirements to gain and maintain their domain supremacy. And so you had these captains, these lieutenants sitting in front of generals saying, if you don't give us these capabilities, either material or non-material solutions, we're not going to be able to do our warfighting job. And so if we keep the warfighter at the beginning of this and talk about the limitations to accomplishing the specific missions that have been put forth to the warfighters, I think everything's going to be fine. But we have to quantify it that way. We have to say, if you don't give us these capabilities, we are not going to be able to accomplish the space superiority mission that you're asking us to do.
Thanks, Bill. Sandra, do you have any final questions or thoughts for the panel?
No, I hope that we were able to cover all the more important points. I think I was just maybe going to ask someone if they think that the culture, the combination of trying to change the culture, trying to change the budget, trying to change personnel policies, I mean, are they maybe trying to do too much too soon? It's possible, but I guess we shall see. And I don't know if Todd, I know Todd, you have some, you have been very much sometimes a supporter, but sometimes a critic of how DoD does things. Are they doing this the right way based on what you heard today from General Thompson?
Yeah, I personally, I think so far they've got a good approach to this. I think, the thing that's always in the back of my mind is that the threats in the space domain are growing over time. And I don't think that's going to change. So, the threats that we face in space 5 years from now, 10 years from now, are going to be worse than we see today. And so I think the sooner you can change, the better. Obviously, you don't want to cut corners. You don't want to be disruptive. But if you're going to have to disrupt something, it's better to do it now than in 5 or 10 years from now when the risk will be even higher.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Todd. Anyone on the panel has any final comments?
Sandra, the only thing I'd add to that discussion that Todd was just speaking about is, if you look at Air and Space Power Journal, just came out last year, and the Schriever Essay Award winner was Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Davenport, who's a 2nd Space Warning Squadron commander. He did a really good job, I think, outlining the implementation of a space warfighting construct. And in that, he talks about the requirement to need the authority, the responsibility, the decision-making, and the leadership support to execute the mission. I was able to do a podcast with him not too long ago. I think a great interview, but something to look at. as we go forward and try to figure out how we move forward as a space warfighting culture and continue to develop it.
Thank you. This was an excellent discussion. Thank you to all the panelists. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, everybody. I also want to give one more thanks to our sponsor for today, Lockheed Martin. And I want to put a word so that you guys can kind of save the date. We're looking at doing our next webinar next week. The title is From Legato 5G to Orbital Debris, the FCC's Role in Space Policy. Look for an announcement on that either later today or tomorrow. And this webinar has been recorded and will be posted to spacenews.com later today. Thanks to all of our attendees and guests, and we'll see you next time.